Greetings, everybody. Try not to bellow too hard and upset our speaker and moderator. Delighted to see everybody here today for the Betty Lou Hummel Memorial Lecture and our keynote speaker, Howard French, who's going to speak to the theme of Africa's fight to secure its place in the world, following on the publication of his most recent book, Africa's Second Emancipation. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Peter Lewis. I'm SAIS's Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and the Warren Weinstein Chair of African Studies here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the annual Betty Lou Hummel Memorial Lecture, organized by the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute with support and collaboration from the SAIS Africa Club, China Club, and the Black Student Union. The Hummel Lecture is now nearly a 10-year tradition at SAIS, which, thanks to friends of Betty Lou Hummel, honors both a remarkable SAIS graduate and celebrates the mission of the SAIS Foreign Policy Institute. It's really a pleasure and an honor to welcome Howard French as this year's speaker to discuss his newest book and explore the theme, Africa's fight to secure its place in the world. My colleague, Professor Learned Dees, will introduce Howard momentarily. As I've mentioned, today's lecture celebrates the legacy of Betty Lou Hummel, a member of SAIS's pioneering class of 1946. At just 20 years old, Betty Lou came to SAIS seeking what she called a chance to go out and see something of the world. That curiosity and sense of adventure would define her entire life. From teaching at a women's college in Istanbul, to building new relationships in Beijing, to navigating diplomatic crises with her husband, diplomat Arthur Hummel, in Addis Ababa and Pakistan. Betty Lou spent much of her life outside the United States contributing to U.S. diplomacy. She also remained devoted to SAIS throughout her lifetime, and when she retired to Washington, she became a frequent attendee of SAIS lectures and other programs, even traveling to China just months before her death to attend a library dedication at the Hopkins Nanjing Center. Her friends tell me she would have been in the front row at today's lecture and would probably have asked the first question. This afternoon's focus on Africa's fight to secure its place in the world also resonates with the Foreign Policy Institute's mission. Since one of SAIS's founders, Paul Nitze, launched the FPI in 1980, the Institute has been committed to uniting the worlds of scholarship and policy in search of realistic answers to the pressing international challenges of our time. And I'll simply say very quickly that we've been talking to Howard French on and off from the African Studies program, the Foreign Policy Institute. He has a very demanding schedule, and we're really delighted that he could join us today. You will hear more from Learned, but he's had a remarkable career that has taken him as a bureau chief for the New York Times to both West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa more generally, and East Asia. And this has inspired and illuminated an intellectual project that has now really been fulfilled or rolled out in more than half a dozen books, looking both historically and contemporaneously at both China's experience, the African experience, and Africa's contemporary and older history, and the interaction, most importantly, between China and Africa, which has become such an important touchstone in the conversation and the discussion of both the continent and China over the last 25 years. So it's with great enthusiasm that I open today's event, and I'll turn things over to Learned Dees for introductions to our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We're really excited to have Howard here. With a long backstory, maybe we'll get into it in the question and answer. But before we start, I'd like to thank our colleagues at the Foreign Policy Institute, Carla Freeman and Brent Kessler, who made this event possible. It really does speak to collaboration with insights and how we can work together. So thank you, guys. Introducing Howard, I'll just start by saying he's a man of many talents. And I'll read his full biography so you get a sense of those many talents. He's currently a professor of journalism at Columbia University and has had a very illustrious career as a foreign correspondent, covering international affairs for the New York Times and included in his 5 books. French has made a name for himself as one of the preeminent foreign correspondents of his generation, covering the world. He has been the bureau chief, Caribbean and Latin America, Africa, Japan and Korea, and China. His reportage was distinguished by deeply layered analysis of current events. Starting as a French to English translator in Abidjan, Ivory Coast in the early 80s, Howard taught English literature for several years at the University of Abidjan and began his career as a freelance reporter for the Washington Post before he was picked up by the New York Times. In addition to his celebrated reporting from around the world, Howard French has become acclaimed author on exploring the role of history in shaping contemporary affairs with a focus on Africa and China. Many of you have seen this book. Many classes use this book. If you haven't, you should Google it and buy it. But that's the sort of analysis that we expect from Howard. His most recent nonfiction book, entitled The Second Emancipation, Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism, and Global Blackness at High Tide, was published last year, 2025. It is the second book of a trilogy exploring Africa's pivotal role in shaping world history. It also builds on his 2021 book, Born in Blackness, another book we use in our class, Africa, Africans in the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War. He's the author of 2 other books on Africa, A Continent for the Taking, The Hope and Tragedy of Africa, and China's Second Continent, How a Million Migrants Are Building the New Empire in Africa. He's also the author of 2 books about China, Everything Under the Heavens, How the Past Helped Shape China's Push for Global Power, and a book of documentary photography focused on disappearing Shanghai. He has an honorary doctorate from the University of Maryland. He's a graduate of UMass. He's a prolific contributor to numerous publications. In developing this introduction for Howard, I went to the Wayback Machine to look and see if there was something interesting that might not pop up when you do a Google search. And I did find this quote, and I think it's appropriate introduction for his speech. I couldn't live with myself if I didn't wrestle with Africa and attempt to bring it to the world's attention. We need to reimagine the world, the way we think of Africa, and get it out of the cellars of our imagination. That's what I found on the Wayback Machine. And in this way of intro, it's over to you, Howard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Learned, and thank you, Peter, and thank you, all of you for turning out, and for all of you behind the scenes, Carla in particular, who helped make this possible. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm from DC, as I joked last night, for those of you who were at the dinner, but I don't get here as often as one might imagine. We're also lucky to be in a beautiful building. This tells how infrequent I've become as a visitor to DC, because I don't remember this building. So it's great to be together in such a nice space. I'm being signaled to speak louder. So I've given already for this book, which came out last August, I've given a great number of talks already. The book tour, formally speaking, is over, but I've been fortunate enough to have engaged interest from lots of different quarters, including present company today. Usually I give a talk that lasts for, I don't know, between 45 minutes and an hour. And it's all about this book. And Learned, as gracious as he was in inviting me, said, speak for 25 minutes, and then we'll take questions. I love engaging with audiences, but I'm not used to speaking to the book in 25 minutes. What makes this even more difficult, I'm going to try, is that I have to actually begin with my previous book, which you mentioned, Born in Blackness. Born in Blackness is the beginning, as Learned said, of the first effort in a trilogy, intended trilogy, and the beginning really for me of a personal attempt at book length to make sense of a lifetime of experience of Africa and of reading and learning about Africa. And so Born in Blackness really is the history of our common emergence, the entire world's emergence into modernity, unfolding over centuries. The time span of that book really is roughly 600 years. We had dinner at a restaurant called Elmina last night, which is a Ghanaian restaurant. And Elmina, whether intentionally or by coincidence, has a great importance in the narrative of the previous book, Born in Blackness. The Portuguese, beginning in the early 15th century, were not, as we are commonly taught, looking for a route to Asia, looking for silks and teas and porcelains. Nothing wrong with silks, teas, and porcelains, but the Portuguese were on a hell-bent mission to discover the source of gold in Africa. And they had been awakened to the availability or the quantities of gold in Africa by an extraordinary pilgrimage to Mecca led by a man named Mansa Musa in the 1320s. This sets modernity into motion. I'm not going to talk about Born in Blackness in depth, but Elmina is the place. They never found Mansa Musa's gold, the Portuguese, but they did find abundant gold in Elmina, which is a Portuguese name. It means the mine, and this was a proof of concept for the Portuguese. It would be some time before Europeans, before what we fancy as European explorers, locked onto the notion of we have to travel to Asia by sea. So Africa, as you can understand from this encapsulated story, really is already being cut out of the picture. We are taught that modernity begins either with Columbus crossing the Atlantic or with explorers reaching Asia and setting the continents in motion or placing them into contact with each other. And Born in Blackness is really written in not as a polemic, but as a corrective to set the record straight and to restore Africa's importance to the commencement of modern history, but also what followed, the development of the transatlantic slave trade, of plantation agriculture built on the institution of chattel slavery, et cetera, which I argue actually created the West. I mean, created the West. I mean, if the West is a joint project, it begins as a European project, but becomes a joint project involving Europe and the continents across the Atlantic and the islands in the Caribbean, and that without enslaved Africans, Europe would not have been able to exploit and to make profitable these new territories and to anywhere to the degree that they did or with the pace that this happened. And so Africa, you can see, and I don't want anyone to get the idea that my entire argument is about slavery, because it is not, but Africa, you can see already from the beginnings of this story, is at the center of things. It's really a motor of history, and it is a motor of history in a way that has been lamentably completely erased. I didn't discover this stuff. I wasn't the first person to ever understand this story. I'm just one of the few people who's found a way to write about it prominently. So this information is sitting there for people who wished to understand, but for whatever reason, through whatever processes, we collectively, as the West, chose not to explore or to highlight this aspect of global history, which centers on Africa. So the first tome of this book, ends at the Second World War, at the end of the Second World War. That's part of the subtitle. Born in Blackness is subtitle. And as I finished that book, I cast about to try to understand what's the right way and where is the right place to pick up the story, to bring us closer to the present. And the final book, which I don't really expect to talk about in any detail here or anywhere else until I get deeply into it, will bring us close to the present. Anyway, so the Second World War ends, and what's happening in the world that implicates Africa? How can we continue to understand Africa as being centered in world history if our starting point is the end of World War II? The answer is pretty obvious. The wave of independences that sweep Africa is the story. And if that is the editorial decision of a writer like me or students like you, then you have to begin to think about who were the main actors in this process? Where did the keystone events take place? And this pointed me, and I suggest to those of you who want to research this on your own, will point you quickly in the direction of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah leads the Gold Coast into independence as Ghana in 1957 after a story of remarkable personal development, which I'll talk to very quickly. I have to talk about everything very quickly. But he does so peacefully. He does so beating the British by playing by their rules, winning elections that they didn't want him to win, that they didn't think he could win, and actually allowing himself to be subjected to the repeated demand that he keep winning elections before they gave him the keys to the colony. They were in disbelief the first time he'd won an election because it was from jail. He organized a British jail. He organized an election campaign from jail, wrote the platform, built a party, smuggling out documents that he scribbled on individual squares of toilet paper, which he traded for food rations in a jail in Accra. So this is the remarkable beginning of this liberation story in the immediate post-World War II era. This book really isn't a straight biography of Kwame Nkrumah. I issued that disclaimer, I think, in the introduction or the foreword or somewhere early in the book. It's really three different types of book married together or conjoined. First of all, it's a global history of an idea. And that idea is the idea that, or the idea that's encapsulated in a word in the title, Pan-Africanism. It's possible to imagine, because Kwame Nkrumah is one of these figures who is so very closely associated with Pan-Africanism, that Pan-Africanism is a struggle, or again, an ideal that arises with Kwame Nkrumah or in Kwame Nkrumah's era. That's not true. And in the research of this book and in the telling of this story, I unearthed an ancient history, if you will, of Pan-Africanism, which begins in the 18th century with people like David Walker, a Black Bostonian born free in Boston, who is writing, so he's born in 1785, he's writing in the 1820s, before the Civil War in the United States, that Black people will never be free and can never be made whole until they have seen to it that all Black people are free and remain whole. And David Walker writes this in Boston with the African continent every bit as much in mind as his enslaved brethren in the United States. Okay, so this is what I'm calling the ancient history of, or backstory of Pan-Africanism. And you find other thinkers on the African continent, in the Caribbean. Most famous one from the Caribbean, quite famous, in fact, is a man named Marcus Garvey, who in the early 20th century picks up this banner and cause of Pan-Africanism and forms a very large movement that doesn't last very long, but which really animates a lot of African-American society and Pan-Caribbean society, and whose ideas also travel on merchant marine ships and through newspapers throughout the African continent. And in between these two poles of a man named David Walker in the 1820s and Marcus Garvey in the 1910s, you have other figures like Martin Delany, a man born
remarkably born free in North Carolina during the slave era, who leaves the South, makes his way to the North, and makes his life's mission understanding the domination by white people of Black people, and articulates, not knowing anything, I think, about David Walker, almost the identical idea that all people of African descent have a joint cause which they must pursue to fruition in order for any Black people to become truly free and redeemed in the world. A man named Africanus Horton, born in Sierra Leone, gets an education in Britain, also born active in the 1850s and beyond, very similar idea. And so the first of the books in the Second Emancipation is this prehistory or ancient history of Pan-Africanism. The second book, and the book's not organized this way, of book one, book two, three, I'm telling you how I threw everything I could into the trunk and then sat on the trunk so that it would close, right? Because I overloaded it with 3 books. The second book is what I would call the global history of Africa. What do I mean by global history of Africa? So Born in Blackness is a kind of its own kind of global history of Africa. This book, picking up in 1945, is a different kind of global history of Africa, no less global though. It's a history of what's happening to Africans in the wake of the Second World War, when they have seen Europeans slaughter each other with an absolute lack of humanity in Europe and elsewhere. And the scales fall from their eyes. Africans have been inculcated to believe that Europe is the unipolar site of civilization in the world, and Africans who have become and have been drafted, enlisted, actually that's not a strong enough verb, have been dragooned into military service on behalf of European nations, are fighting and supporting combat throughout the Second World War in all sorts of theaters, and witnessing this, witnessing a kind of real-time live discrediting of any notion that Europe is this place of hallowed ideals because of the utter barbarity of the war. And so Africans return as veterans from these campaigns, return to Africa, including to Ghana, on the one hand, with their eyes opened to the real way, one might say, the world works, where a stage where might makes right, and where claims to morality are more often superficial than real, that they are used as cudgels to wield power over others and not applied internally by the people who are wielding. Africans returned from World War II, having been given implicit promises that they will be granted enlarged political rights in their homelands, that they will be made whole for their service on behalf of European nations through the payment of retirement benefits and healthcare costs and things like this. And they are disillusioned to see in the wake of World War II how Europeans very quickly reneged and very widely reneged on these sorts of promises. And this sets in motion what becomes the liberation movement, the independence movement of Africans in the wake of World War II. So I didn't have to search hard to find a way to pick up the story in 1945. The story was sitting there for me. The history was set in motion by the end of World War II. And by the way, Africans didn't discover the urgent necessity of independence all on their own. They saw other people struggling in other parts of the world, struggling for independence. India becomes independent, the Philippines becomes independent, etc. And all of these things give impetus to this African ideal of throwing off the shackles of foreign domination, Africa having been dominated by other continents for centuries, right? And it has a particular resonance in the place called Ghana that is at the narrative center of the book, and in the person of Kwame Nkrumah.
Ghanaian soldiers, it was still called Gold Coast, had fought in Burma in the Second World War. Britain had most of you will not know this, but if you're a buff of World War II military history, scratch around and you will discover that Britain had very few successes in terms of land warfare in World War II. Britain was a naval power. Britain was successful ultimately in defending itself in the air against Germany's attempts to subdue and perhaps invade it. Britain didn't have many land battles in World War II. By virtue of Ghanaians fighting on behalf of Britain in the jungles of Burma, Britain defeated Japanese armies in Burma and were therefore able to resupply nationalist troops in China that were combating Japanese imperialism there. Had the Japanese been able to win that war, this would have vastly complicated the West's efforts to prevail in World War II. We don't hear any of this, but it was Africans, in fact, Ghanaians in particular, who carried the day on behalf of the West. I'm going to take a little snippet out of my 1 hour talk to give you a really brief anecdote and then jump to the third book as I've conceived of this. Unfortunately, after this book, the Second Emancipation had not quite gone to press, but was in production, which in publication means it's locked down. You can't change anything in it. The Financial Times ran a feature which involved the secret history or the history of a long forgotten's too passive, a long concealed photograph. This photograph was of the Free French forces led by Charles de Gaulle walking down the Champs-Élysées in Paris at the end of the war in a mood of high celebration, that France was redeemed, Nazi rule had been cast off, and this was a story about how the French did it. We all know, and this is not to the discredit at all of the French, we all know that the Free French didn't really win the war. The French were liberated because of a whole lot of other things, the Soviet Union, which we don't talk about very much, carrying the brunt of much of World War II against the Germans. Also, the American invasion of France in Normandy, which leads to a series of Nazi reversals, et cetera, et cetera. But the French are trying to reconstruct a way of remembrance about the war that can restitch them together as a nation, can repair the wounds of the recent past, and allow them to march confidently in the future. I don't know how many of you have seen photographs of that day. You should look for them. Photographs, for those of you who know anything about World War II history, are famous. Charles de Gaulle was taller than I am. He's surrounded by French people, and there's crowds on both sides of the road, and people are wildly cheering and rightfully jubilant. Well, the Financial Times photograph is of a Black man, a veteran, who's rushing, I would like to think quite innocently, into the frame of the photograph because he had fought on behalf of the French too and wanted to be part of the celebration, and he is set upon by the forces around Charles de Gaulle because there was no intention to include anything about Africans in the picture of the French victory. There was no way to accommodate this within the French view of French wholeness in the wake of World War II. Already I've told you about the amplification of the myth of a victory by the Free French. Well, if the French had to allow for the participation of Africans, Black Africans in this photograph, that would have undermined the entire thing, right? And so the Financial Times in some archive discovers this photograph and gives it a big display and a long, deeply informed historical take, deeply informed for a newspaper. And I'm telling you this story because it should awaken in you a sense of the way that erasure works. Erasure does not work by happenstance. Erasure doesn't work along the way. Erasure isn't an accident. Erasure is a project.
And this is an example that we have been fortunate to recover of the way this project worked with regard to France. France is not exceptional in this regard. How many World War II movies have you seen? You guys are young to be watching World War II movies, but actually there have been some recent ones. Dunkirk, no, that's World War I, right? Anyway, every now and then they still make World War II movies. Do people of color ever appear in the World War II movies? It's practically unknown, unheard of. So that's the same type of erasure taking place, right? As it was, in fact, about 1 million Africans participated in World War II on behalf of Western forces. Okay, this was not some little vestigial effort. This was not some appendix. This was a serious component in every imaginable way of the war effort, and it has been completely erased from historical memory and from the way this history is taught. And so that's book 2, restoring this. And this is really instrumental to Nkrumah's rise, because the troops that had fought in Burma returned from the war, and the British reneged on their promises to pay them the kinds of remuneration that they would do, and they rioted. Nkrumah had nothing to do with the riot, but because Nkrumah had begun to argue for independence loudly, the British assumed that he had organized the riot and threw him in jail. I told you it was from jail that he organizes what becomes his first victorious campaign. So what is book 3? Book 3 is a global history of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah his history needs to be told as a global history because of the contours of his life. Kwame Nkrumah was born in the southwestern most remote corner of Ghana in 1907, hard by the border with the French colony of Ivory Coast. Tiny ethnic group, the Nzima, which is astride the border. Nzima are equally present on either side of the border. So Nkrumah grows up as a child, he's aware of something. The way that external forces have divided and subdivided Africa to Africa's prejudice, to Africa's harm. You can't grow up in these circumstances and have to get into a dangerous canoe to visit your aunt across the lagoon that separates Ivory Coast from Ghana without knowing something. There's something strange about this. The British and the French had not built a road to connect Ivory Coast and Ghana. They were not about connecting Africans. They were not about developing Africa. They were about extracting what they wanted to get from Africa for their own benefit, right? So Kwame Nkrumah, the British had invested almost literally nothing in education in Gold Coast at this time, which is remarkable to me because already in the early decades of the 20th century, the Gold Coast is making a lot of money for Britain through, as you might expect, gold, but also through cocoa. By the end of World War II, the Gold Coast is the second largest earner of foreign exchange for Britain in its entire empire. Okay, so in the first decade or the second decade of the 20th century, there's still, as late as that, there's almost no effort by Britain to educate, to create educational infrastructure in the Gold Coast. Kwame Nkrumah lucks into, by dint of a very determined mother, an education in a one-room schoolhouse run by a Catholic priest in southwestern Ghana. He makes a deep impression on the priest as a kind of precocious learner and just, very capable boy. And by dint of a bunch of accidents, Nkrumah gets selected to go to the capital and to join the first serious high school built by Britain in the Gold Coast. After decades of rule of the Gold Coast, Britain builds a high school, an academy, and it's called Achimota College. Nkrumah enters the first class of this college, and in the midst of this war of Ghana at this time, fancy, highfalutin education at Achimota College, Nkrumah comes under the influence of two really important people. A man named Nnamdi Azikiwe, who would become, this is just an extraordinary thing, for every time I speak to this,
who would become decades later the first president of Nigeria. So Nkrumah, the first leader of Ghana, is coming under the influence of the first president of Nigeria, who happens to be working as a newspaper editor in the Gold Coast, writing editorials that are strongly pro-independentist. And Nkrumah also falls under the influence of a man named Kwame Agre, who is an assistant dean of Achimota College, the only Black figure in the high administration of Achimota College. And both of these people had elements of Garveyism in their lives, belief in the ideas of Pan-Africanism as articulated by Marcus Garvey. And both of these men had been educated in the United States. Agre had been educated at Columbia University, where I teach, and Azikiwe had been educated at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the oldest historically Black college or university to have a formal graduate degree program. Both of these men see promise in Nkrumah, urge Nkrumah, who has a thirst to learn. Nkrumah initially thinks he might, I've gone way past 25 minutes. Nkrumah, who initially thinks he might want to become a Jesuit priest. That's how seriously he took his religious education. And they're saying, no, go to the United States. Don't go to Britain. Don't become a Jesuit. Go to the United States for your education. This becomes the beginning of the global history of Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah, on the basis of their recommendation, lands in Harlem in 1935, and strange as it may sound, discovers Blackness. What do I mean by discovers Blackness? Kwame Nkrumah, you may object, was Black already. How did he discover Blackness? He discovered Blackness because if you are born in a colony where everybody is Black, and the only people you know are Black, and everyone you see around you is Black, Blackness ceases to be a thing. Blackness is like water for a fish. You're just Black, right? Kwame Nkrumah arrives in Harlem, and Blackness is a thing. For the first time in his life, he sees politics of Blackness. He sees currents of thought related to Blackness. He sees shades of color encompassed by Blackness. And his mind is lit on fire by this. And he only spends a week initially in Harlem. He has to get to school. He's a little bit late. He goes to Lincoln University, and largely by coincidence, I don't think he chose Lincoln at all on this basis. Lincoln in this era is a place that has an unusually large number of international students from Africa and the African diaspora in the Caribbean. And so Kwame Nkrumah now has a human tissue with which to work to try to understand this new discovery of his, this thing called Blackness. And this takes place at Lincoln University, and I have to cut this short, but Nkrumah makes his, he has to pay for his tuition, and he does things like tutoring other students, but he also does preaching. He has this religious educational background, and he starts preaching in Baptist and Methodist churches in the mid-Atlantic to make money. And he begins to understand the African-American tradition, church tradition of call and response and of communication from the pulpit and reading your audience and meeting people where they are. And this is where Kwame Nkrumah becomes forged as a public speaker and as the politician, actually, that he ultimately would become. The second great stage for this is Howard University, where Kwame Nkrumah doesn't go to school there, but he begins to visit there in the 1930s and make all kinds of acquaintances with what was at the time the most amazing all-star roster of Black talent in any university setting anywhere in the world. Nkrumah's just set, I've already used this metaphor of set ablaze, his set afire, but he is really illuminated by all of this. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward to say that after 10 years in the United States, after the accumulation of 4 degrees in rapid succession in these settings, both at Lincoln and at Penn, Kwame Nkrumah goes to Britain thinking that he will study law in Britain. And He is met at the docks for the transatlantic ship that carried him by a man named George Padmore, whom he had been introduced to by C.L.R. James, who was a faculty member and outstanding intellectual at Howard University. And Padmore, at this precise moment, is beginning to put together a network of pro-independence grouplets. I have to say grouplets because these were not parties, these were not big movements yet. These were little clusters of people in each of the African colonies scattered around the continent who were beginning to toy with the idea of how to strategize around independence. And Padmore takes Nkrumah under his wing. He makes him the Secretary General of the 1945 Pan-African Conference at Manchester. He introduces him to W.B. Du Bois, who becomes a lifelong influence on him. And after nearly 2 years later, again, by dint of circumstance, a group of highfalutin lawyers, African lawyers in the Gold Coast, are beginning just then in 1947 to try to figure out whether they should form a political party, and if so, how to do so, right? These are all African lawyers, well-to-do, trained in the best places in London, part of a tiny educated elite in the Gold Coast. And they write to the African Student Union in London and they say, we're beginning to think about strategizing around these things, but we recognize we have one weak point. We don't have anyone among us, the lawyers, who really knows how to talk to the common people. Do you have anyone who can do this? And right away, they suggest Kwame Nkrumah. This proto-political party recruits Nkrumah back from the UK, and in very quick succession, partly due to the riot that I mentioned of the veterans who had been cheated out of their British benefits, Kwame Nkrumah is launched into the thick of politics, and he splits from the people who are forming the party, and he says their platform is independence as soon as it is feasible, and his platform is independence now, and the rest is history. There's a lot more history. I call this book Global Blackness at High Tide because one of the big narrative threads of this book is about how extraordinarily rich the connections were between African independence politics and the civil rights movement in the United States. This is something that has been completely erased from popular memory in this country and in Africa. And I don't say erased in the same way I mean when I use erasure for the Champs-Élysées photograph. I don't really understand the mechanism. But in the 1950s and early 1960s, African politics and African-American politics were joined at the hip. Extraordinarily deep connections were formed then. And Africa was often in the lead in terms of African Americans looking to Africans and saying, and Kwame Nkrumah in particular, and saying, if this man can strategize in such effective ways as to defeat the world's biggest and most powerful empire peacefully, then we African Americans have no reason to be discouraged by any setback that we face. We have the means within us and can take inspiration from what has been achieved in Africa. This is just an extraordinary story on its own and might have become a book all by itself, but for my bad habits. The final thing I want to refer to really is the Cold War, which is another deep thread in the book. And this piece of history is also forgotten. Wasn't fully understood by me by any means either when I set out to begin researching the book. And that is, in the independence era, Africa was regarded as being extraordinarily important by the powers of the world. Nothing could be less true today, right? Nothing could be less true for the last few decades. Kwame Nkrumah was the first foreign leader to be received as a guest by John F. Kennedy. Kennedy, during his campaign for president, gave speeches in which he talked about Africa more than 300 times. 300 different speeches. How many speeches have any of you in your entire lives heard in which an American presidential campaign used the word Africa? I'm hearing silence, right? So I'm not going to go on about this, but the book explores the great energy with which the powers of that era, the United States, the Soviet Union, and to some the former colonial powers, and to some extent China, were vying with each other for connections with and the allegiance of African countries. And Kwame Nkrumah is really at the forefront of this history also, because he was the avatar of African independence and was a man who had incarnated really the African continent in the eyes of the outside world. So I'll stop there. I look forward to your questions, and I'm sorry if I went on too long.
Howard, you cover so much ground in your books. Thank you for summarizing it in a short period of time. And it's a lot to think about. We have a big audience here today, and in respect for the audience, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. So let's start with Howard the person, a young man growing up in Washington, D.C. in the 70s, I guess, right? In the 70s, how did you begin to think about the world? Because America's always been inward looking. The world has never been part of our education. How did you and your family in Washington and Boston, when you moved, begin to think about things outside of the United States? Well, what happened?
A few things happened. We're all products of accidents. None of us chose our parents. None of us chose the time when we were born. These things happened in their own ways, and we had no agency in them, right? I happen to have been born into a family to two parents who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement from an early stage. My father was a medical doctor. My mother was an educator, and they spent the summers of my childhood on the great marches, participating in the great marches. Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were on the bridge that day. And so that's the beginning of the story. And my father and mother, through a process that I feel bereft for not having understood, they've both passed, for not having understood with greater detail, underwent an evolution in which they began to understand themselves in their own time the notion that the struggle of African Americans is related to bigger struggles. And they became caught up long before I could have even begun to imagine this. I'm a child, after all. They became caught up in the fervor of African independence. I grew up in Washington, D.C., as you said, and there was a group that they belonged to in the Washington, D.C. of the mid to late 1950s called the Friends of Ghana. They joined that before I was born. And these were, for the most part, but not exclusively, African Americans, professionals, educated people, who had some kind of notion about the connectedness of the world and these ideas that I spoke to, of David Walker and Africanus Horton and Marcus Garvey, that there are connections, organic connections, even if they're largely concealed for us or hidden, right? That exist and should be uncovered, right? And so my father eventually, to fast forward decades, my father was a surgeon and sort of late mid-career, decides he wants to get into public health and international public health and work in Africa. And so my father, when I was in college, was recruited by the World Health Organization to run a regional healthcare project for 20 West and Central African countries, and of primary care. And I began to visit Africa in that time as a college student, and it changed my life completely. I thought I had a little piece of this conversation at dinner last night. How did I become a journalist? I thought at the end of college, I'm good with words. I like to read. Maybe I'll go, if I can't think of anything else, I'll go to law school. Some of you will find that familiar, right? And I went to Africa because I had been in school when my family was living there, thinking I'll just give myself that 1 year experience, and it seized control of my life. That's how different Africa was from anything I had known previously, how rich my experiences were there, how much history I began to uncover or to discover. And along the way, I became a journalist. I had no intention of becoming a journalist. So I think I've exceeded the bounds of your question, but it begins with these accidents.
Yeah, very good. You studied, at least I've seen that you took some African studies courses in college. This would have been in the late 70s, early 80s. I'm curious about what you learned or heard in your classes about Africa, reflecting 45 years later. What were the themes that were presented to you as a student about Africa at that time?
Well, I'll isolate 3 examples. One of them, I read a lot of African history, and I was like any other American. Nobody in that era, and most people now, are not brought up to believe there's anything called African history or any African history worth thinking about. Like, going to study history, why would you think about Africa? So my family was living in Africa. I said, let me study some African history. And I'm like, wow, actually, this was a naive discovery for me. There's a lot of history there, right? I began to study African art. And I remember the professor very well. I took a class in African art at Smith College. I was not a Smith student, Smith being a female school, but I was allowed to take classes there, and had just an extraordinary, Elizabeth Hopkins was her name, took an extraordinary class about African art. And so my mind was kind of reeling from, having the curtains open to the fact that Africa is a place of high cultural achievement, that Africa is a place of deep history. And then finally, and probably most on the point of your question, I took a class again at a women's college. Don't get the wrong idea here, guys. But at Johns Hopkins, I took a class in African politics. And it was an African-American professor whose name I've never been able to recover. Don't recall. I've actually written, I'm sorry, it was at Mount Holyoke College. I've written to them and asked them the name of this person, and they've been able to help me anyway. It was an African-American guy, and it was in the midst of the Cold War, and his big interest was in Angola. And he shed light on us, members of this class, about the ways of the Cold War in Angola. And, in such a fashion as to sort of alert me to the deep complexities of American foreign policy and of great power rivalry. The United States was supporting one of the nominally independentist factions locked in a civil war in Angola. The United States supported 2 factions at different times and in different ways. And Moscow supported another faction, the MPLA, which was after a very long and very destructive war, eventually prevails. But the United States forged back then situational alliances with China and supporting another group called the FNLA. And the United States had interests in Angolan oil offshore via the American oil company Chevron. And so the United States is simultaneously doing business, or an American company is simultaneously doing very significant business with the MPLA government, the Marxist government, and fighting, supporting 2 different movements in 2 different ways to combat the other 2 rival factions in Angola. And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but these are the places, these are the instances in which intellectually for me at a very early age, I began to understand Africa as a stage of great complexity and of necessary study if you want to really understand anything.
Yes. Okay. Last question I'll ask is related to this book, China's Second Continent. There's always discussion in academia about China being good, bad, all the relationships. And when this book dropped, I think in 2012, 2013, the prevailing perspective within the US government that China was a negative. And this book actually talks about something completely different, which is people who are not connected to the Chinese government, who are going to Africa to be pioneers, try to make money, et cetera, et cetera. And that was something we never discussed in the State Department, this whole nuance. So it's a very nuanced book. My question to you is, what made you write this book? And was there anything you assumed before you wrote it that turned out to be incorrect or surprising?
So the first inklings of this book occurred to me when I was living in Shanghai in the middle of the first decade of the century. And I was the bureau chief, a fancy word for I don't know, that's the terminology of the New York Times there. And because I was the bureau chief, I had an office with a window. And the office with the window looked out on the entrance of the big hotel complex and hotel and office complex where my office was. Again, happenstance here. One day I happened to look up and here comes a motorcade of an African head of state flying a standard. I recognized the flag. I said, wow, that's the flag of Mali. Big motorcade coming in. I'm thinking to myself, well, that's kind of interesting. What the hell could that be about? I know a lot about Mali. I had spent a lot of time in Mali. I knew a fair number of people in Mali. I said to myself, thankfully, Howard, get up from your computer, walk down into the hotel lobby quickly, and see if you can intercept some of these people and ask them what's going on. So I did that. And I had this encounter with people, actually ran into some people I knew. And they said to me, French, you don't know what this is about? And I said, no, I don't. This is the Chinese putting on this big push to embrace Africa. And, I didn't know. There's no time for any depth here, but that's the first I heard of it. And so this is the first inkling of this idea. And just to keep the story within time limits, I left the Times in 2008. I came to Columbia. Before I left the Times, I wrote a series about China and Africa in the Times. And when I left the Times, by that time, a lot of people are beginning to write about China and Africa. There's been the first big China-Africa summit in Beijing, and it's certainly not my proprietary topic, right? A lot of people are writing about China and Africa, but I was dissatisfied in the way that I was what I was reading. What I was finding were articles written by people who knew China or thought they knew China, but didn't really know Africa. And pretending on the basis of simply knowing China or thinking they know China to be able to theorize or make grand statements about what all this meant. Or people who knew Africa or thought they knew Africa, but didn't know China, and pretending that they were had license to make grand theoretical statements about what this all meant. I said to myself, listen, I know China and Africa. I speak Chinese. I've already by that point been to almost every country on the African continent. I know people all over Africa. Let me figure out a way to join the two ends of this equation and do something different. And my primary orientation back then, because I was so dissatisfied really with the kind of the common shoddy theoretical nature of what I was reading, to eschew theory altogether. Let me just go out there and see what these encounters look like. Let me go onto the terrain where Chinese people and African people are working together, living together, fighting with each other. I don't mean militarily fighting with each other, but in conflicts of various kinds with each other. Let me just go understand what this is in person and leverage my prior experience in both of these parts of the world. And so this is really the product of that kind of thought process. And there's a little bit of, I have ideas that you could liken to theory, but it's really a reportage based on the ground experience that is gathered or accumulated in a really extensive way. I spent a year traveling on the continent and broken up into a few different trips and then compiled my results more or less in a journalistic voice, and that's what resulted in this book.
And for the audience who hasn't read the book, what's the takeaway?
Because it's not a theoretical book primarily, I will not hesitate to answer that way. I'll answer it. I'll try to scratch the itch in a different way. So
let me reframe the question.
Right.
What were the insights that students can use as a starting point?
Well, the most obvious insight for me immediately was, and this was amidst a lot of theorizing here in the West about China, what China is trying to take over Africa. These large numbers of people, I used the number 1 million in the title. Controversially, some people were upset by that. Actually, I think at its height, there were more than 1 million Chinese people who had moved to the African continent. But the most immediate insight that I gained from this experience is that these people had not been sent by anybody. They were not part of some kind of preconceived project by the Chinese government. This was not a plan per se. And often, in fact, the Chinese people, usually rather ordinary Chinese people, resented the Chinese government on the ground. I don't mean in grand political terms. They thought of Beijing as being a bad place or that communism was, I'm not talking about any of that. They thought that the Chinese embassy in whatever country they found themselves had one agenda and they, as people trying to establish themselves in a new homeland, if you will, had other interests, and they didn't coincide very often. And in fact, they thought that the Chinese government, as represented by ambassadors and their staffs, were often actually hostile to them and to their needs. So I guess if I had to pick one takeaway, that would be the one thing that I would cite.
Okay, yeah. Great. So I'm going to open it up to questions. I ask that if you have a question, be concise so we can get as many questions asked and answered as possible. But I'm actually going to start with a student from my class. Howard, one of the things I have a challenge with students is getting them to read whole books. I don't know if that's a generational thing. I just finished the class and I looked at my evaluations and students said, oh, great class, but we're not going to do all that reading. NISA won a book contest in my class, Born in Blackness. She brought it with her. So I'm going to give her the first question.
Okay. Wow, lots of pressure. I think, and I know you're going to talk about all of your books, but since I won this one, I would like to ask a question about Born in Blackness, if that's okay. I think one thing that I really liked, and I'm not quite finished, but I'm on the way, is I really liked your insertion of the Haitian Revolution, and especially like putting it almost in a central and an influencing way. And I think at least at SAIS and at other places, the Haitian Revolution is usually left out of the conversation. So wondering what, I guess, as grad students who are learning about different regions and different cultures, how can we start back including erased narratives or narratives that are often left out into like our everyday conversations and everyday work? Okay,
Thank you. So I've used the word erasure today with you, and you've just used the word erasure or erase. And in some ways, this word is really inadequate, and don't take this as a reproach, right? It suggests there's some little curly Q or squiggle on the blackboard that got wiped out, right? That's actually not what we're talking about. We're talking about enormous things that were made to disappear, right? through whatever mechanism, right? We could have a debate about what the mechanism is, but the fact that they have disappeared is not so subject to debate. And here's what I mean by that. The United States, follow me, I first of all, I've told you, I believe that the West was made by Africa. Okay, I don't think any of you've heard that before. I deeply believe that, and I've articulated that in this book. And I'm willing to defend it if anyone wishes to debate the idea with me, right? The United States was made by Haiti. What do I mean? How could you say that? The United States made itself. We had a revolution. We had founding fathers. We had, these great thinkers and gentlemen farmers and all of this stuff and grand ideals and the Enlightenment and patati patata, right? We made ourselves. Who could say that the Haitians made us? What do I mean by that? I mean that by defeating in succession the armies of France, Spain, the greatest powers of the day. France, I'm doing this in order. France, Spain, Britain, and then France again. The Haitians changed the course of American history, and in fact made the United States in the following way. The elites of the Old South in the United States, meaning Virginia at its core, but also Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, were alarmed. If these Black people can defeat the United States was not a great power. If these Black people can defeat the great powers of the day, maybe we shouldn't have so many Black people in Virginia. Like, this is dangerous. We need to scatter them around, because if they're concentrated here, they can certainly one day rise up and defeat us too, right? This becomes the proximate initiator of the colonization, or in its euphemism, the settlement of the rest of the United States. On the one hand, Napoleon nearly goes bankrupt fighting 2 wars, France in Haiti, failing to subdue the Haitians. Napoleon, desperate for money because Napoleon had ongoing conflicts on the European continent with Russia, etc., desperately needs money. He sells the Louisiana Purchase to Thomas Jefferson's government. This doubles overnight the size of the United States, makes it for the first time a continental or semi-continental country. It's no longer a bunch of colonies hugging the Atlantic coastline, and it opens up the Mississippi River Valley, which is where a very concerted effort over the course of 2 generations takes place to move Black people out of the Old South so that they couldn't do a Haitian revolution in the Old South. Okay, this is the beginning of a big American story as opposed to a little American story, right? And it starts in Haiti. It's all about Haiti. And I want to believe that almost none of you have ever heard that or heard this explained that way, right? Don't believe me. Research it yourselves. That's the best way. Somehow, nobody ever learns this or gets taught this or exposed even to this, right? And so I don't know if I've answered your question well, but that would be the beginning.
Other questions? One there and one there. Let's get 2 questions.
Good afternoon, sir. You spoke about how Africa used to be viewed as very important to the world. And you referenced Kennedy mentioning Africa many times in his speeches and how that's kind of become less the case as time has gone by. My question to you is, what would you envision as ideal foreign policy for Africa from a U.S. perspective?
Great. Let's get the second question too.
Thank you for your talk. Having read, I read Born in Blackness and Everything Under Heaven, and both kind of 2 contrasting perspectives, 2 different centers of focus. How do you see that relationship now, kind of 13 years after you wrote that book there, with the BRI initiative, with critical minerals becoming more important? Do you see it as a repetition of previous trends? How do you think African policymakers can deal with great rival competition now?
These are two very different questions. So you guys are testing my ability to hold completely separate thoughts and to respond at once, but I'll do my best. I'm not a foreign policy guy. I don't really, that's not my job. I'm a critic and a historian. Okay, so I write columns on an almost weekly basis for foreign policy in which exercise my critical muscle. And, people in the State Department have often over time been made uncomfortable by my work. And that's because I don't think that the United States has ever in my lifetime had very much of an Africa policy that is worthy of the name. And I want to make something clear here. I don't think that's the fault of the Africa Department. I think that stems from something much bigger and deeper. Right? I met the head of, I don't remember if I get the title wrong, forgive me, but I think he was Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, a guy named George Moose. Is that the right title?
That is right.
So I met George Moose in the mid-1990s on a tour of West Africa. He was traveling with Susan Rice, who had become the Secretary of State. She was his deputy. And George Moose, I got into a limousine going from one official thing to another. Somehow I got into their bubble. And I'm in the limousine riding with George Moose. And I asked him a pointed question about American policy toward Africa. My chance as a journalist, right? I'm in the car with the Assistant Secretary. And George Moose says to me, without losing a beat and without cracking a smile, says to me, Mr. French, my job is to make sure that Africa never comes to the attention of the President of the United States. He said that to me, meaning my job is to manage this continent in such a way that the President and the National Security Council and the Secretary of State can devote all of their attention to bigger issues, places where American interests are superior, right? I think grosso modo, we're still stuck in that kind of mind frame. And we've been in that mind frame for a very long time. I don't have a policy to prescribe for you, but I have a prediction. And my prediction is that the United States and Europe are going to come begging to Africa's door sooner or later. Why is that? That's because for the remainder of this century, the marginal growth in the human population will occur in Africa. That means that most of the young brains in the world will come from Africa. That means the state of consumption, which is pretty important if you're a capitalist, the state of consumption in the world will depend on what happens to Africa. If all of Africa is poor and most of the new people are African, that's a big loss, right? It's because Africa is the place where urbanization is taking place faster than anywhere else, and faster than it's ever happened anywhere else in history. Europe and the United States are aging on an extraordinary timeline. The demographics of these two parts of the world are falling off the cliff, right? They have an advantage, or something of an advantage. China and Japan's demographics are declining even more quickly than the West's demographics are, but for a whole variety of historical legacy reasons. China and Japan really don't imagine themselves ever as becoming big places open to large-scale immigration. Like the idea of we're going to look to Africans to help replenish our population is a bridge too far, right? The United States has a lot of Africans in its midst, people who are called African Americans, right? There's nothing strange about being an African or a member of, at least until 5 minutes ago, the African diaspora in the United States, right? And so the United States has, oddly, even though it's done nothing to cultivate this, it has a comparative advantage in a world of declining demographic resources, where they're going to need brains, not just people to clear bedpans, brains and workers and inventors and entrepreneurs and taxpayers. They're going to need all of those things in order to keep their systems functioning. And it may just come to pass, I'm predicting to some degree it will come to pass, that the Europeans and the Americans, it will finally dawn on them that Africa is in fact not a corner of the world that deserves to be kept in the corner of the world and kept out of mind, like George Moose said, but a vital part of the world, a part of the world that we can't do without. Not do without because we have an offshore platform getting oil from it, or rare minerals or things like that, the traditional things we've looked to for Africa, but because of the people of Africa. Well, that's my first answer. My second answer is, I never really wanted to be a China-Africa guy. I wrote the China-Africa book for the reasons that I mentioned. They were organic. It just seemed like I had to do this because I had these two different pools of experience, and there was a moment in time when this relationship or these relationships were coming into focus in the world. And I said, I'd be remiss not to write about this. So I did it. What I've come to think since then, what has become ever more clear to me is the way in which, and this relates somehow, in fact, to the previous exchange, the way in which Africa became a workshop for China in terms of China's broader ambitions in the world. China begins to globalize via Africa. China in the 1990s has a program called, under Jiang Zemin, has a program called Go Out. And the center, meaning political elite in Beijing, all of the provinces to compete for business out in the world. And they looked around and said in the 1990s, what are we going to compete for? Like, we don't have big corporations yet. The Japanese and the Koreans and the Americans and the Europeans are well established. How can we compete? And they eventually develop an answer that quite appropriate to the moment, that if we don't have big, famous, high value brand name companies yet, we Chinese, what we do have is very, very deep experience building infrastructure on a gigantic scale. And they put two and two together and they go to Africa, desperate for more infrastructure. And they say, we can build big things for you more cheaply than anybody else can, and we'll finance it, right? And so this becomes a laboratory for China, which then subsequently, first of all, proof of concept that Chinese companies can act on such a global scale like this, and then proof of concept for what becomes the BRI. I don't know if everyone here knows the BRI, but BRI is Xi Jinping's signature initiative for launched around 2013, 14, somewhere thereabouts, to go out and do what China had done in Africa, but on the Eurasian continent first, and then all over the place. Go look for big contracts, go build big infrastructure, go establish economic interests on a gigantic scale. China had cut its teeth in Africa. Here's how this relates to the first question. What American would think that America could go to Africa to learn something, that there could be an experience that you could get in Africa that could subsequently inform something ambitious that you would do elsewhere in the world? It's a totally alien thought to anyone American thinking about Africa. Who would go to Africa to talk to Africans about what they should do? Tell them, hey, here's what the right policy should be, or don't do this, or don't do that, or be like us, or follow the programs of the IMF or the World Bank, or just very, very standard off-the-shelf things. The Chinese went to Africa. I'm not saying this was entirely scripted or preconceived, but in fact, the Chinese went to Africa with an open enough mind to understand the lesson value of their experience there for bigger, broader purposes. And this becomes the second question back here.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah. I'm a first-year student here at SAIS. And in a world, and in America, where books are being banned, like in my home state of Florida, and where secondary education and like having professors like you and people who tell revisionist histories, how do you see a way forward of like hope for people like me who are members of Generation Z, who I feel a little bit pessimistic about the work that you're doing, like it getting exposure, like how you're in. I love that you're here in this room today, and thank you to Professor Leonard Dees and the Foreign Policy Institute for bringing you here. But what's like the advice that you could give to people like me who are facing or dealing with pessimism, considering the state of the world, the state of America?
Little question. Wow. Okay. So the Ghana question is very easy, right? I didn't set out to write a book about Ghana for Born in Blackness in any way. I'll tell you how that book started. I was writing a previous book about China, a historic book called Everything Under the Heavens. And it was my attempt to understand how has China understood itself as a global power for the duration of Chinese history. And obviously the answer changes in different eras, right? And so I'm researching Chinese history deeply. And at a certain point in the archives of Columbia University, where I teach, I begin to read contemporaneous accounts of the first encounters between Portuguese and China. And it is in the reading of those encounters that I discovered this gap of roughly 75 years in which Europeans were not at all trying to get to Asia, but were dwelling in Africa for explicit purposes, right? Completely wrapped up in what Africa had to offer, right? What Africa had to offer, to the point where Portugal named its treasury in the royal palace, that's where the treasury sat, the House of Africa. Okay? Portugal in the 15th century or early 16th century called Africa the New World. It runs through all the literature of that era. The New World. How many of you have ever heard anything like either of those things? And so I made a mental book note. I said, God, Howard, you have to finish the China book. And I did my best on it. But this wasn't a project just sitting with me. I have to write about Ghana and history. This was an accident. And when I finished the China book, after a suitable interlude, I resumed researching what becomes my history of the arrival of modernity. And I began retracing those steps, and those steps by the Portuguese and subsequently by the Spanish and then subsequently by others, the French and the British, lead me to Ghana with the discovery of gold in 1471 at Elmina, right? So that's for the first book. For the second book, as I told you at the beginning of today's talk, I knew I had to resume this effort of mine at the end of the Second World War. And so what are the big things happening at the end of the Second War? Independence. You know, it's easy to underappreciate what independence meant for Africans. I call the book The Second Emancipation because the first emancipation is the end of enslavement, the end of a trade in human beings across the Atlantic Ocean. The second emancipation is not just, it's important, but it's not just the birth of new states and the acquisition of flags and national anthems and having your own president or prime minister or the like. It is also the end of a kind of rank form of economic exploitation that went so far as to include, even in the post-war era, forced labor. Europeans were employing Africans in forced labor regimes even after World War II. And so with the end of the colonial era, you have a second emancipation on the African continent, which is the reason for that reference. So why Ghana? Ghana because of Kwame Nkrumah being the leader in what turns into very quickly a wave of African independences. It's a coincidence. You know, I didn't look for it for this reason, but I also have a lot of personal history in Ghana. I've spent
I've traveled in Ghana since 1975. Sounds scary a little bit maybe, but that's the truth, right? I can speak some Ghanaian languages to some extent, right? That was all just a wonderful convenience and happenstance, right? But I didn't start out thinking, let me tell a Ghanaian story at all, at no point.
Last question about the times we're living in and optimism. You're going to leave us on a high note.
I don't know if I can leave you on a high note. I don't want to leave you on a dark note either. You said something about, pessimism or visibility of work like this. I'm not complaining, I'm speaking now through my own small personal experience, but my books have done very well. Born in Blackness was a phenomenon, right? My publisher, look, when I write a book, I'm not thinking about how many copies it'll sell. I think that would just completely spoil my entire process, right? I'm thinking about what kind of story I want to tell and how well can I tell this story and how can I add value to the subject that I'm writing about. Those are my preoccupations, right? So I didn't know what Born in Blackness was going to do and didn't really think about it. Born in Blackness went crazy. Born in Blackness has been translated into something like 10 languages. It was a bestseller in Germany, of all places, on the bestseller list. Okay. I'm still being invited to speak about Born in Blackness all the time, right? The Second Emancipation came out last August. The formal book tour is over, but I was in Toronto 5 days ago. I'm with you today. I'm going back to Toronto for some strange reason. I have 2 completely unrelated hosts in Toronto in the space of 2 weeks. I'm going back to Toronto next week. I'm going to San Francisco the week after that. It's like this all the time. And so it is true that there's a lot of darkness around the circulation of ideas and about education and about the openness of our mind and of our society in the United States at this moment, right? But I don't wish to be negative to the point of pessimism, because the future is still open. And the future is not going to be made by the people who are running things today. The future is going to be made by the people sitting in front of me now. And it's on you. And you can build the future. The future is going to come out of your agency. And if you have activated minds and you know how to build good, healthy communities and you know how to speak to people in ways that can connect with them, then you can build a better future, right? And I really believe that. It's not some pap that I'm trying to share with you, right? It's true that there's a lot of negativity right now. There are a lot of things to be pessimist about. But to yield to pessimism means you've just given up. And I don't believe in that.
Wakur.
Thank you so much, Howard. This is just enlightening. I'm spellbound. We had a conversation last night and, we're asking, what is Nigeria doing? And so I kept thinking about it, and what I kept thinking about is if Nigeria were to actually do something, right, and if Pan-Africanism were to succeed currently, what would that success look like, right? Institutionally, would it look like would it be economic fiscal unity? Would it be defense coordination? Like, what are we looking at? And in your chronicling of Nkrumah's ambitions, right? I've not read all your work, I've read some of it. You highlight tensions and contradictions in his ambitions, right? If we were to walk back those, what's more determinative, right, of the constraints to Pan-Africanism as he imagined it, right? And how would that translate to current realities in Africa? And is there a path to success? However, whatever you define success in Africa today.
So Nigeria is a very special place. And most of us have no notion of how special Nigeria is. Nigeria is the blackest place on earth. What do I mean by that? I mean, it is the place with the most Black people anywhere. And it's going to get more Black if we're thinking of Blackness in demographic terms. Okay. Nigeria, according to the best available projections, by the end of this century, will be as large as China or India or larger. Think of that. Remember what I said about brains and the West coming to the doorstep of Africa and saying, please, we need to build a better relationship. We need you, right? Nigeria is one of the places it's going to happen, right? This does not mean that Nigerians can sit on their hands and wait for the best. No, they cannot do that. But Nigeria is a place of extraordinary importance for the remainder of the century. It really is. I cannot emphasize that enough, right? So that's point one. Point two, what was Nkrumah's greatest insight? Nkrumah's greatest insight was, it was not a romantic thing about Blackness. Nkrumah was not romantic about Blackness. Nkrumah did not revere Black people in the way that you can hear present day rhetoric about Blackness on social media sometimes, right? Nkrumah, as I said, he was born like a fish in water. Blackness was the sea for Nkrumah in the beginning, right? He didn't have a romantic notion of Blackness, but he understood that for Black people to overcome the historical, the anvil of history that sat atop of them, wherever they may be found, on the continent or in the diaspora, that Black people had an urgent necessity of stitching themselves together in a bigger community. That's what Nkrumah's Pan-Africanism meant. That we need to forge not just a continental polity, but a global polity of Blackness. And I want to let you know why I think the insight was so powerful and why I think this is such a difficult thing to bring about, right? So why so powerful? There's another part of the world called Europe. Europe is presently bemoaning its weakness, right? Europe saw the need 2 generations ago to build a union. Kwame Nkrumah was articulating something like this before the Europeans were. For Africa, the Europeans implement something like this. And even the thing that the Europeans were able to build was not sufficient to overcome the inherent weaknesses of Europe's geopolitical constitution, meaning of a large number of generally rather smallish states. That it's hard to defend yourself in a world of very big powers, often very vicious and always very self-interested powers, if you are coming from a place of balkanization. Europe's living this right now. Even though there's a union, we need a defense policy, right? Okay, who's going to pay? No, you pay. No, you pay. Or we need to invest in AI. No, who's going to? We can't let your company go first. Our company should. We should build a fighter jet. Well, who's going to be the main contractor? These become almost insurmountable issues when you have come to the table from a place of balkanization, right? So this is the power of Nkrumah's insight, that Africa, vastly more balkanized than Europe, vastly weaker than Europe by any standard measure, has no chance of defending itself in the world, in the kind of world that we actually live in, if it doesn't overcome its geopolitical constitution. So a lot of people get this wrong. They think this was some kind of naive or simple or romantic idea that Nkrumah had, and maybe just driven because he, is a megalomaniac. He wants to be president of Africa or something like that. That's wrong. The reason for this was understanding that Africa stands no chance as a continent with, at the time, 17 landlocked countries and mostly small countries and countries divided by different legal regimes and different monies and different colonial languages, et cetera, et cetera. There's no chance, right? The only chance is agglomeration, is building bigger polities, of somehow forging some kind of African way of moving forward, right? Nigeria is going to be important to this because Nigeria, in part because Nigeria is so big. If Nigeria fails, if Nigeria collapses, if Nigeria falls apart, all of West Africa is sunk, right? Congo, country that is barely avoids, and for some time now has barely avoided the abject status of a failed state, is an immense weight on all of Central Africa. Sudan, I'm just mentioning the big states of Africa. Sudan, an incredible prejudice to the entirety of East and East Central Africa, right? Ethiopia, in and out of war all the time, right? These are hardships of a continental nature that are going to have to be overcome in order, before Africa can begin to do the Nkrumah thing, or to try to begin thinking imaginatively about this historical imperative of overcoming the Berlin Conference, overcoming balkanization, and forging something more viable of its own design for its own needs and purposes, right? These are immense challenges, right? They're not helped. My last words to you, or no, it was not to you. My last words leaving the restaurant to someone who expressed great skepticism last night. It's great pessimism. I've already said I refuse to yield to pessimism, but the nation state is a really, really sticky thing. Sticky in the sense that once you have a nation state, it throws up a political elite. And the political elites that nation states throw up do not ever or seldom wish to imagine surrendering any of their prerogatives. It's great to be the elite of a nation state, and to surrender some of that for some higher purpose, some more idealistic purpose, requires sacrifice. And human beings typically are not terribly willing to subject themselves voluntarily to great sacrifice, right? And so this is the structural problem. The nation states were set in motion by the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, by subsequent European colonization, and by willy-nilly, scattershot independence. And Nkrumah saying in 1963 at the founding meeting of the Organization of African Unity, we have to come together, we have to have a plan, we have to do this. And the other countries, especially the big states, say, who is this small boy telling us we should join together? We are the leaders of big countries, right? We would prefer to have our big country than to be part of some larger thing in which our prerogatives get stepped upon for some bigger purpose, right? And we remain stuck there. So here we are. I think the logic, Nkrumah's logic, remains as pertinent as ever, but the challenge has not gone away and may, in fact, have only continued to get bigger.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. Thank you guys for coming. Thanks for staying. Thank you to Howard for being so open to express what you've learned over 50 years and captured in your 5 books. Thank you very much for coming.